The night was merciless. A relentless winter storm swept through the desolate countryside, burying the land in a thick, unbroken sheet of white. The wind shrieked like a tormented spirit, rattling the brittle wooden walls of Daniel Carter's isolated cabin. Ice crusted along the edges of the windows, warping the view outside into a haze of frost and shifting shadows. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit, the only source of warmth a meager fire struggling against the cold. Its weak glow flickered across the room, stretching long, uneasy shapes along the walls. The air smelled of burning wood and aged whiskey. Daniel sat alone at his rickety wooden table, shoulders hunched, fingers curled loosely around a glass of amber liquid. His face was lined with years of solitude, his tired eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The rhythmic ticking of the clock was the only sound, an unwanted reminder of time slipping away, unnoticed. Then, the knock came. Soft. Measured. Unnatural. Daniel's grip on the glass tightened. No one came out here. Not at this hour. Not in this weather. His pulse quickened as he turned his gaze toward the door, the cold creeping deeper into his bones. For a long moment, he sat frozen, listening. The wind howled, the fire crackled, and then another knock. His breath hitched. Slower this time, heavier. He exhaled through his nose, setting the whiskey aside, the old instincts whispering at the back of his mind. His hand hovered over the revolver lying on the table, a relic of another life. He didn't pick it up. Instead, he pushed himself to his feet, the floorboards creaking under his weight. The air was sharp against his skin as he approached the door. Each step felt deliberate, his body tense, every nerve on high alert. The handle was cold beneath his fingertips. A pause. A flicker of hesitation. Then, he opened it. A rush of icy wind surged inside, biting at his skin, stealing his breath. Standing in the doorway was a child. Small. Frail. Barefoot. Their trembling form barely concealed by a thin, tattered cloth. Snowflakes clung to their pale blue skin, a ghostly contrast against the night. Their eyes unnaturally large, violet, and shimmering with a strange inner light locked onto his with a silent plea. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Not human. Before he could move, a shadow shifted beyond the dim glow of the porch light. A second figure stepped forward from the darkness, a woman. Tall, willowy, wrapped in a torn cloak that barely shielded her from the storm. Her movements were slow, heavy with exhaustion. The hood of her cloak obscured her face, but he could feel the weight of her gaze. The child, barely standing on shaking legs, reached back and clung to the woman's tattered clothing, seeking protection. Then, the woman spoke. "Please," she whispered, her voice brittle, barely more than breath. "Help us." Daniel's fingers tightened against the doorframe. His instincts screamed at him, "Shut the door. Walk away." He knew what they were. Villery. The hunted. The forsaken. The ones they warned people about. He had seen the news. He had heard the stories. A dying race, alien refugees seeking shelter on a world that did not want them. Feared. Rejected. He should close the door. And yet, his gaze flickered back to the child, so small, so fragile, their tiny body racked with violent shivers. Snow gathered around their bare feet, melting into freezing puddles. Their violet eyes, impossibly deep, held something he hadn't seen in years. Not fear. Not anger. Hope. His jaw tightened. Damn it. The cold seeps into Daniel's bones as he stands in the doorway, staring at the woman and child. The wind screams past him, biting at his exposed skin, trying to push him back inside. Snow swirls around their feet, clinging to the tattered edges of the woman's cloak, the child's trembling frame barely shielded from the storm. He doesn't move. Doesn't speak. His instincts scream at him to shut the door. Walk away. Keep his life simple. He's spent years avoiding people, avoiding trouble. He knows exactly what happens to those who get involved with the Villery. They disappear. But the child, small, fragile, barely able to stand, etches itself into his mind like a ghost that won't leave. A helpless thing abandoned to the mercy of the cold. The woman doesn't beg. She doesn't try to persuade him. She only watches him, her dark, hollow eyes saying more than words ever could. She knows he's deciding their fate. Knows she has no control over it. Daniel exhales sharply, running a rough hand down his face. He already regrets what he's about to do. But still. Get inside. The woman stiffens. For a moment, she doesn't move, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. He can almost hear the wheels turning in her head. She's calculating, wondering if this is a trap. If she's just walked into something worse than the storm outside. Daniel scowls. I don't have all night, he mutters. Before I change my mind. Another long pause. Then, slowly, she steps forward, cradling the child closer as she crosses the threshold. Daniel shuts the door behind them, sealing out the howling wind. The fire crackles softly. The room is dim, cast in flickering gold and deep shadows. The storm rages outside, shaking the cabin. For the first time in years, Daniel Carter is not alone. The air inside the cabin is thick, heavy with unspoken tension. The fire casts restless shadows across the wooden walls, their flickering shapes stretching and shifting like silent phantoms. Daniel leans against the wall, arms crossed, watching. The woman doesn't relax. Her sharp, wary gaze sweeps the room, cataloging every exit, every possible threat. She stands stiffly near the door, her body coiled like a trapped animal, prepared to bolt at the first sign of danger. Daniel doesn't blame her. If their roles were reversed, he wouldn't trust himself either. The child Ravi lets out a small, pitiful whimper. Their tiny fingers tighten around the fabric of Trey's cloak, their whole body still trembling from the cold. Their alien skin is eerily translucent in the firelight, the faintest blue veins visible beneath the surface. Daniel exhales through his nose and turns away, moving toward a small closet. He digs around for a moment before pulling out an old, threadbare blanket, moth-eaten at the edges but warm enough. Without a word, he tosses it onto the couch. Sit, he says gruffly. Trey doesn't move. Daniel rubs the back of his neck, irritation creeping into his tone. I'm not gonna call anyone. If I wanted you gone, I wouldn't have let you in. A long silence. Then, finally, Trey moves. Cautiously, she steps toward the couch, lowering herself down in slow, deliberate motions. She holds Ravi close as she sits, the child curling against her, their tiny fingers never loosening their grip. Even now, she doesn't speak. Daniel watches her for a beat before sighing. You got a name? She hesitates, studying him, measuring him, deciding whether to answer. Then finally. Trey. Daniel nods. And the kid? Trey's grip tightens around Ravi. For a moment, he thinks she won't answer. But then. Ravi. Daniel exhales, shifting his weight against the wall. His voice comes out lower this time, quieter, but not any less demanding. "All right, Trey." His eyes narrow slightly. "You wanna tell me why the hell you're out in the middle of a snowstorm?" Trey doesn't answer right away. Her fingers tighten around Ravi, her body tensed like a wire pulled too tight. The fire casts shifting shadows across her face, highlighting the exhaustion etched into her features. She looks like someone who's been running for a long time too long. Finally, she speaks. "They'll come back." Her voice is raw, hoarse, like she hasn't used it in days. "Maybe longer." Daniel's gut tightens. "Who?" he asks, though deep down, he already knows. Trey lowers her gaze, brushing a protective hand over Ravi's trembling form. "The ones hunting us," she murmurs. "The ones who don't think we deserve to exist." A slow breath escapes Daniel's lips. He's heard the stories. Everyone has. Villery found dead in alleyways, dumped in rivers, disappearing without a trace. The government won't acknowledge it. The news barely covers it. But people talk. And what they say isn't pretty. "You sure they know you're here?" he asks, voice quieter now. Trey nods once, sharp and certain. "They will. It's only a matter of time." Daniel drags a hand through his hair, his mind racing. He should have shut that damn door. Pretended he never heard the knock. But it's too late for that now. His gaze drifts back to the child, small, fragile, barely breathing. Ravi's violet eyes flutter open for the briefest moment before slipping shut again, their tiny body racked with shivers. Something settles in Daniel's chest. Heavy. Unshakable. He exhales through his nose. "We can't stay here." Trey stiffens. Her eyes snap to his, sharp with suspicion. "We." Daniel lets out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Yeah. We. Because if they come looking, they won't just take you. They'll take me, too." Trey studies him, her expression unreadable. She doesn't trust him. Not yet. But she doesn't argue. Instead, after a long pause, she gives a small, cautious nod. It's not much. But for now, it's enough. The night drags on, heavy and restless. Outside, the wind howls through the trees like a warning. Inside, Daniel clears a spot on the kitchen table, shoving aside an empty whiskey bottle and an old oil lamp. He pulls open a drawer, digging through the clutter until his fingers brush against rough paper. A map. Trey watches him from the couch, still holding Ravi close. The child has barely moved, their breathing shallow. Every so often, a small, pained whimper escapes their lips. It twists something deep in Daniel's gut. He spreads the map out, running a calloused finger along the faded roads. "There's a freight yard a few miles south," he mutters. "Trucks come and go all night. If we can slip into one, we might get out without being noticed." Trey frowns. "Might." Daniel glances up, raising an eyebrow. "You got a better plan?" She doesn't answer. The silence between them is thick, weighted with uncertainty. Trey exhales and looks down at Ravi, brushing her fingers gently across the child's forehead. She swears under her breath. "She's burning up," she murmurs. "We have to move soon. She won't last much longer in this cold." Daniel presses his lips into a thin line. His mind is screaming at him, telling him this is a mistake, that he's risking too much for people he barely knows. But then he looks at the kid again. And he knows he's not about to let a child freeze to death. "Get some rest," he mutters, pushing himself up from the chair. We leave before sunrise. Trey watches him carefully as he moves toward the door. He pulls on his coat, steps onto the porch, and lets the cold night air hit him like a slap to the face. The wind bites at his skin, but he barely notices. Instead, he stares out at the dark horizon, his jaw tightening. Because deep down, he knows. By morning, everything will change. The fire in the hearth has faded to a dull, pulsing glow, casting long, restless shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, the wind wails like a dying thing, its cold fingers slipping through the cracks in the wood, making the room feel smaller, tighter. Trey sits on the worn-out couch, her body rigid, arms wrapped protectively around Ravi. The child barely moves, her breath faint, her tiny fingers curled into the fabric of her mother's tattered cloak. The fever has tightened its grip, leeching the last bit of strength from her small frame. Daniel watches from the doorway, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. "She's burning up," Trey murmurs, mostly to herself. Her voice is tight, raw with quiet panic. She shifts, pressing a cool hand to Ravi's forehead, her movements careful, deliberate like a woman trying to keep herself from breaking apart. Daniel exhales through his nose. He's never been good with kids. Hell, he's barely been good with people. But he knows what hunger looks like. What exhaustion does to a person. Clearing his throat, he gestures toward the small kitchen. "Got some soup?" "Ain't much, but it's warm." Trey's head snaps up, her dark eyes narrowing slightly. Suspicion flickers there, brief but sharp. She's used to kindness being a trick, a prelude to something worse. But right now, she doesn't have the luxury of refusing. After a long pause, she gives a small nod. Daniel turns away, moving toward the stove. The cabinets creak as he rummages through them, pulling out a dented can and a loaf of stale bread. He pours the thick, murky broth into a pot and sets it on the old gas burner. The scent of simmering vegetables and salt fills the air, not much, but better than nothing. Behind him, Trey whispers something under her breath, a soft, melodic hum of foreign words. It's gentle, rhythmic, meant for Ravi's ears alone. A lullaby, maybe. Or a prayer. By the time he sets the bowl in front of her, Trey is already shifting Ravi in her arms, coaxing her awake. The child's violet eyes flicker open, glassy, and unfocused. Trey lifts the spoon, pressing it lightly to her lips. Ravi swallows weakly. Daniel watches, then looks away, suddenly feeling like an intruder in a moment that isn't his. "I'll give you some space," he mutters, pushing himself up. Trey doesn't answer. Her entire world is cradled in her arms. Daniel steps outside into the cold. The wind bites at his skin, but he barely notices. The road ahead is uncertain. He has no damn clue what he's gotten himself into. But there's no turning back now. The moment Daniel steps back inside, he notices the bowl. Empty. Scraped clean. Trey still sits on the couch, unmoving, Ravi tucked against her chest. The child has fallen into a fitful sleep, her breath coming in small, uneven sighs. Daniel frowns. "You eat?" Trey doesn't look at him. Doesn't answer right away. Then, finally, she shakes her head. Daniel exhales sharply, disappearing into the kitchen. A moment later, he returns, setting the remaining hunk of bread beside her. "Eat." For a second, Trey just stares at it. Her fingers twitch slightly, hesitation warring with something deeper, something raw and desperate. Then, As if a dam inside her finally cracks, she snatches the bread and tears into it. She eats too fast. Too hungrily. Like someone who has gone too long without knowing when the next meal will come. Daniel doesn't say a word. He just sits across from her, arms crossed, watching in silence. By the time she finishes, her breathing is uneven. She exhales shakily, and for the first time, some of the tension in her face eases. "Thank you," she murmurs, barely above a whisper. Daniel doesn't look at her. Just nods, his gaze fixed on the dying fire. The cabin settles into silence once more. But this time, it's not quite as heavy. The night deepens, the wind outside whispering against the cabin walls like ghostly fingers searching for a way in. The fire, though fed with fresh wood, burns low, its glow stretching long shadows across the wooden floor. Trey shifts slightly on the couch, careful not to wake Ravi. The child stirs but doesn't fully wake, her small body curled tightly against her mother's warmth. A moment passes. Then another. Trey exhales, glancing toward Daniel. He sits by the fire, his gaze distant, lost in thoughts she cannot read. She hesitates, then begins to loosen the folds of her cloak, preparing to feed her child. But something in her instincts tells her to be cautious. She glances up, watching Daniel carefully. He catches the look almost instantly. Without a word, he stands, grabbing his coat. "I'll be outside," he mutters. He doesn't wait for a response, doesn't linger to make her more uncomfortable. The door groans softly as he pulls it open, stepping into the cold. Trey lets out a slow breath, her shoulders easing just slightly. She still doesn't trust him. Not fully. But at least he understands boundaries. That, at least, is something. Outside, Daniel leans against the wooden railing of the porch, exhaling a plume of mist into the freezing air. The night stretches before him, endless and quiet, the dark sky thick with heavy clouds. Somewhere in the distance, a tree groans under the weight of ice, its branches cracking in protest. He barely knows this woman. He barely knows this kid. And yet, something sits heavy in his gut, an instinct he can't shake. He'll protect them. No matter what. Daniel doesn't know how long he stays outside, staring into the abyss of snow and silence. Long enough for the cold to settle into his bones. Long enough for his breath to come out in slow, steady clouds. By the time he steps back inside, the room is quiet. The fire has brightened again, its warm light flickering over the cabin walls. Trey sits exactly where he left her, adjusting the blankets around Ravi's small form. The child sleeps deeply now, her feverish shivering reduced to the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of breath. Daniel moves toward the fireplace, tossing another log onto the embers. The dry wood hisses, catching flame, sending golden sparks swirling up the chimney. For a long moment, neither of them speak. Then, Trey finally breaks the silence. "You live here alone?" Daniel glances at her, his face unreadable. "Yeah." She watches him, as if piecing something together. "For how long?" He shrugs. "Few years." A beat of silence. Then, "Why?" Daniel grips the iron fire poker, stirring the embers, watching the way the flames shift and dance. He doesn't answer right away. When he does, his voice is quiet. Easier that way. Trey doesn't press. She just nods, her expression unreadable. But in her dark, knowing gaze, Daniel recognizes something unsettling. She understands loneliness. She understands loss. She understands him. The cabin is quiet, save for the occasional pop of the fire and the wind pressing against the walls, whispering like unseen voices. Trey shifts slightly, pulling her cloak tighter around herself, as if shielding against more than just the cold. I tried other places, she says softly. Before this. Daniel looks at her, waiting. No one would help. Her voice is steady, but something underneath it wavers. They looked at us like we were things. Like we weren't worth saving. She doesn't say it with anger. Not anymore. Just exhaustion. A deep, worn-out kind of pain. Daniel exhales slowly, his jaw tightening. He's seen it before. People turning away when things got hard. Looking right through someone who needed them. It's easy to ignore a problem when it isn't your own. And yet, here she is sitting in his cabin. His cabin. He never thought he'd be the one opening the door. They're idiots, he mutters. Trey blinks, caught off guard. What? Daniel shrugs, glancing at the fire. Ain't much, but, you got a place here. For now. A long silence stretches between them. The wind howls again, shaking the windows, but inside, the warmth holds. Then. Thank you, she whispers. And for the first time, her voice carries something other than fear. The fire flickers lazily, its embers pulsing like a slow heartbeat. The warmth has settled into the room, softening the edges of the night. Ravi's breathing has steadied, her fever no longer raging, though Trey still keeps her close, her fingers lightly curled around the child's small hand. Daniel leans against the wall, arms crossed, staring at nothing in particular. How long you been running? He asks. Trey hesitates. Not because she doesn't know the answer, but because saying it out loud makes it real. A long time. Daniel watches her carefully. She isn't just running. She's been running. The kind of running that wears a person down to their bones. He doesn't push, but she can see the question in his eyes. She exhales, eyes flickering toward the fire. Since Ravi was born. Daniel's brow furrows. He expected weeks. Months, maybe. Not years. He shifts, rubbing a hand over his jaw. Who's after you? Trey flinches. Barely. Just a flicker of movement, a slight tightening of her shoulders. But Daniel catches it. People who don't stop. It's not what she says, it's how she says it. Flat. Emotionless. Like she's already accepted the worst. Daniel's stomach twists. He doesn't ask more. Not yet. But deep down, he already knows. Whatever she's running from, it won't just go away. Outside, the wind howls, a restless, mournful sound that snakes through the cracks in the wooden walls. Snow flurries dance against the window pane, tapping like impatient fingers. The fire burns low, its embers pulsing with a slow, tired rhythm. Trey sits close to the hearth, staring into the flames, lost in thought. Shadows flicker across her face, carving out the exhaustion in the lines of her expression. Then, suddenly. Before this, she says, her voice quiet but steady, I had a home. Daniel, seated across from her, glances up. He doesn't speak. He just waits. Trey doesn't look at him. Her gaze stays fixed on the fire, as if the past is somewhere deep inside it. I wasn't alone. We had a village. Her voice takes on a faraway quality, like she's reaching across time. A place where no one had to hide. She pauses, exhaling softly. And then one day, someone came. Said we were unnatural. Said we shouldn't exist. Daniel's jaw tightens. His fingers press against his arms, the weight of her words settling in his gut. She exhales, closing her eyes briefly, as if pushing back the memory. They burned everything. A long silence stretches between them. The fire crackles. Outside, the wind moans. Finally, Daniel speaks. And Ravi. Trey's hand moves, brushing the child's tangled hair. Ravi doesn't stir. She doesn't remember. There's something fragile in her voice now. I was already running when she was still too little to know. Daniel watches the way her fingers tremble slightly. The exhaustion behind her eyes. The weight she's been carrying for so long. He exhales sharply, standing. Get some sleep. Trey hesitates. She doesn't trust kindness. Not anymore. But her body is so tired. She nods. Daniel moves to the window, staring out at the swirling snow. His jaw clenches. He doesn't know these people. Doesn't know their pain. But he knows one thing. Whoever did this. They're not going to touch them again. Something is wrong. Daniel feels it before he sees anything, an instinct buried deep in his gut. The kind that once kept him alive. He grabs his rifle. The wind screams as he steps onto the porch. Snow whips around him, sharp and fast, the cold biting through his coat. The world is a blur of white and gray, shifting, restless. Then, a shadow moves. Far down the road. Barely visible through the storm's thick veil. Daniel narrows his eyes. His grip tightens around the rifle. It could be nothing. An animal. A trick of the light. But his instincts tell him otherwise. His instincts tell him they've been found. Daniel steps back inside, shutting the door with deliberate care. His pulse is steady, but his mind races. He turns the lock, sliding the deadbolt into place. The cabin is old, the wood worn, but it's solid. At least for now. He checks the rifle's chamber. Full. Across the room, Trey stirs immediately, her senses sharp despite the exhaustion weighing her down. She's spent too many nights like this waiting, listening, fearing. What is it? She asks, her voice low but urgent. Daniel hesitates for half a second. No point in lying. Someone's out there. Trey stiffens. Her arms instinctively tighten around Ravi's small frame, as if she can shield her daughter from whatever waits beyond the walls. The child doesn't stir. Are you sure? She presses. Daniel nods once. Didn't get a good look, but I know when I'm being watched. A heavy silence settles between them. The fire crackles in its stone hearth, throwing restless shadows against the walls. The wind outside screams, pressing against the cabin like a living thing, rattling the shutters with cold, clawed fingers. Then Trey exhales, sharp and knowing. They found us. Daniel studies her. The way her hands tighten, white-knuckled, around the edge of her cloak. The way her jaw sets, already bracing for the worst. His grip on the rifle shifts, steady and sure. Not yet, they haven't. Trey paces near the window, her cloak brushing the wooden floor as she moves. Her breath fogs the glass as she peers into the swirling chaos outside. Snow churns in wild currents, thick enough to swallow the trees whole. But she knows something is out there, hidden within the storm. Watching. If they're here, we have to go, she says, her voice sharp with urgency. Now. Daniel doesn't move. He stands near the fire, rifle in hand, his expression unreadable. And run where? Trey spins to face him, frustration flickering in her eyes. Anywhere but here. If they know where we are dash. They don't. His voice is calm, final. It cuts through the room like the crack of a gunshot. Trey clenches her jaw. How can you be sure? Daniel meets her gaze evenly. Because if they did, they wouldn't be watching. He nods toward the window. They'd be here. That stops her. She hates it, but she knows he's right. Whoever is out there isn't sure yet, they recircling, searching. Waiting for a mistake. Daniel glances toward the floor, where Ravi lies curled in her mother's arms, her tiny chest rising and falling in shallow, fevered breaths. A child who has known nothing but running. Nothing but fear. His fingers tighten around the worn stock of his rifle. If we run now, we'll leave tracks, he continues. They'll follow. Trey exhales sharply, rubbing her temples. The cabin feels too small, too fragile, like a trap waiting to spring shut. She's spent years moving, never staying in one place long enough to be caught. To stop now feels unnatural, dangerous. But she sees the logic. She swallows, her throat dry. So what do we do? Daniel doesn't answer right away. He moves to the window, watching the storm swallow the world outside. The wind wails like a dying thing. Then he looks back at her. We wait. The hours crawl by, stretched thin by tension. Daniel doesn't sleep. He sits near the door, rifle across his lap, listening. The wind moans through the trees, rattling loose shutters, slipping through cracks in the old wood. Every shift in the storm makes his fingers tighten around the gun stock, his ears straining for anything, footsteps in the snow, the rustle of something moving where it shouldn't be. Trey doesn't sleep either. She sits near the fire, cradling Ravi against her chest. The child's fever has broken, her breathing steadier now, but Trey doesn't relax. She strokes Ravi's tiny hand absently, her thoughts far away, replaying old nightmares. Burning villages. Screaming voices. The scent of smoke in her hair. Neither of them speaks. Because words won't change what's coming. By morning, something will happen. And they need to be ready. The first rays of dawn slice through the frost-covered windows, painting the walls in pale, lifeless light. The storm has passed. But the silence it leaves behind is worse. Daniel stands at the window, his breath fogging the glass. The snow is smooth, untouched except for something far at the tree line. Shadows that don't belong. Shapes that weren't there yesterday. No movement. No figures stepping forward. But that feeling hasn't left him. Behind him, Trey shifts. She's already awake, holding Ravi close, her arms wound tight around the child as if she could will them both invisible. She looks at him, voice barely above a whisper. Anything. Daniel shakes his head. Nothing. She exhales, but there's no relief in it. Just tension stretching thinner. That's worse. Then. A knock. Loud. Heavy. The sound shatters the quiet, echoing through the cabin like a gunshot. Trey freezes. Her grip on Ravi tightens, her body going rigid. Daniel doesn't move. Another knock, harder this time. More insistent. Then a voice, low and familiar. Open the door, Carter. Daniel's blood turns to ice. They know his name. Trey's eyes go wide. How dash? Go. His voice is low, firm, leaving no room for argument. Take Ravi. Hide. Trey hesitates. Now. She vanishes into the back room, the door clicking shut behind her. Daniel closes his eyes for a breath, steadies himself. Then he grips his rifle, exhales, and steps forward. And unlocks the door. The door swings open, and the cold rushes in. 3 figures stand outside. The man in front is tall, built like a soldier, his face sharp with the kind of hardness that only comes from experience. The kind of man who's done this before. Many times. His coat is thick, dusted with snow, but it does nothing to soften the presence he carries. Behind him, 2 more stand rigid, their hands hovering near their weapons. Watchful. Silent. The kind of silence that speaks volumes. Daniel leans against the doorframe, forcing an easy expression. Early for visitors. The leader doesn't smile. His eyes cold, calculating, stay locked on Daniel's face. We're looking for something. His voice is calm. Too calm. Daniel shrugs. Can't help you. The man's gaze doesn't waver. A Villery woman. And a child. He tilts his head slightly. Seen them. A long pause. The wind whistles through the trees, shaking the porch beams. Daniel doesn't blink. No. The man watches him, searching. For a crack. A hesitation. Daniel gives him nothing. Then. A sound. Soft. Faint. Barely there. But it's enough. A muffled whimper from inside the house. Ravi. Trey must have covered her mouth too late. Daniel's stomach tightens. He doesn't move. Doesn't react. But he knows the man heard it. The leader's expression darkens. You sure about that? Daniel shifts just slightly, blocking the doorway a little more. His stance casual, but ready. I don't take in strays. His voice is flat. Unconcerned. The man steps closer. Too close. The cold in his eyes is worse than the winter air. You lie to me, he says quietly, and I'll burn this house to the ground. A tense silence. Daniel's fingers twitch near the rifle. His heart pounds, but his face stays unreadable. He could shoot. 3 shots, 3 bodies. But he knows what happens next. More men. More fire. More blood. So instead, he does the one thing that might keep them alive. He smirks. And he lies again. Daniel leans in slightly, letting his smirk widen, keeping his voice just on the edge of amused. You think I'd be dumb enough to take in a Villery with you guys crawling all over town? He lets out a slow chuckle, shaking his head. They're not exactly subtle. The leader doesn't move. He's studying Daniel, reading him, searching for the truth. The tension is razor thin. Daniel lets out a breath like he's tired of the conversation. Go ahead. Search the house. You won't find anything. It's a bluff. A dangerous one. Because if they step inside, if they so much as take a single step past the threshold, Trey and Ravi are dead. The man watches him for a long moment, the silence stretching too tight. Then. He raises a hand, stopping his men before they can move. His eyes never leave Daniel's. Not today, he says quietly. But if I find out you lied. He doesn't finish the sentence. He doesn't have to. The words hang in the freezing air like a promise. Then he turns, leading his men back into the snow. Daniel doesn't breathe until they're gone. Then, slowly, he shuts the door. Locks it. He turns around. Trey is already there, standing in the hallway, eyes wide. "They'll be back," she whispers. Daniel nods. "Yeah." A beat of silence. Trey looks down at Ravi, still curled against her. Then back up at him. "We have to go." Daniel's jaw tightens. He's known it since the first knock on the door. Since the first time he saw them standing outside. "They're not safe here anymore." "We leave tonight," he says. Trey nods. No more time for doubt. No more time for hesitation. It's time to run. The hours slip through their fingers, vanishing too fast. Daniel moves through the house with sharp, precise motions. No wasted time, no wasted effort. He grabs supplies from drawers, from hidden compartments in the walls. Food. Ammunition. A knife. A handful of cash. A map, edges worn from use. Trey is silent, methodical. She wraps Ravi in layers of thick fabric, making sure the baby is warm but not too bundled to move quickly if needed. The child barely stirs, her breath soft against Trey's shoulder. The fire has long since died. The only sound inside the cabin is the whisper of fabric, the faint scrape of Daniel's boots against the wooden floor. Outside, the world is eerily still. No wind. No animals. Just silence. Then. A sound. Boots crunching in the snow. Daniel freezes. His grip tightens around the rifle. Trey's breath catches, her muscles going rigid. A shadow moves past the frosted window. Not a trick of the light. Not the wind. Someone is out there. Daniel doesn't hesitate. He moves to Trey, his voice barely above a whisper. "We go. Now." She nods once. No argument. No second guessing. And just like that, their escape begins. Daniel moves first, easing the back door open with slow, practiced care. The cold bites at his skin the moment they step outside, but he barely feels it. His mind is too sharp, too focused. Snow crunches beneath their boots too loud. Every step feels like a risk. Trey follows closely, her arms wrapped protectively around Ravi, holding her close, shielding her from the cold and the world beyond. The town sleeps, but Daniel knows better than to trust the illusion of peace. Danger lurks in every shadow, waiting. They move through the narrow alleys, keeping close to the frozen brick walls, slipping between buildings like ghosts. The cold air burns in Daniel's lungs, but adrenaline keeps him moving. Keeps him sharp. Then. A voice. Low. Rough. Too close. "Check that house again." Daniel barely has time to react. He grips Trey's wrist and pulls her into the deepest part of the shadows, pressing her against the frozen stone. They don't move. Two figures step into view. One of them kicks the front door open with brutal force. Wood splinters. A harsh echo rings through the empty streets. They're searching. Daniel watches, heart hammering against his ribs. If they had waited even a few minutes longer. Trey looks up at him, eyes wide, breath shallow. He sees the fear there but also something else. Resolve. They have to move. Faster. Daniel tightens his grip on her hand. A silent command. She nods. And together, they slip deeper into the night. The outskirts stretch before them, an open expanse of untouched snow, the road ahead pale and gleaming under the moonlight. Too exposed. Too open. Daniel scans the area, his breath curling in the frozen air. No figures. No patrols. Just silence. This way, he whispers, motioning forward. They move quickly, boots sinking into the fresh powder, leaving behind a trail of footprints. Trey keeps Ravi pressed against her chest, shielding him from the biting wind. The child doesn't stir. Then, a sound. Faint at first. Distant. Engines. Daniel curses under his breath. He grabs Trey's arm, yanking her down behind the rusted shell of an abandoned truck just as headlights sweep over the road. The glow cuts through the darkness, too bright, too searching. The vehicle crawls forward, slow and deliberate. It's looking for something. Looking for them. Daniel grips his pistol, heart pounding in his ears. Then, it stops. The silence is suffocating. A door creaks open. A heavy boot crunches against the snow. A figure steps out. Scanning. Watching. Trey holds her breath. Her fingers tighten around Ravi's tiny form, willing him to stay quiet. Daniel doesn't move, muscles coiled, waiting. The figure lingers. Their gaze sweeps the open road, their stance tense, like they sense something just beyond their reach. Then, a voice calls from the vehicle. Nothing here. A long pause. Then the figure turns, boots retreating. A door slams. The vehicle pulls away, the red glow of its tail lights disappearing into the blackened horizon. Daniel exhales, slow and measured. Trey does the same. They don't speak. There's no need to. They rise from the shadows and keep moving. The city is behind them now. But the real journey has only just begun. The road stretches ahead, an endless ribbon of white beneath the heavy snowfall. The wind howls through the barren landscape, carrying whispers of something unseen. Each step is heavier than the last, exhaustion settling into their bones. Daniel glances at Trey. Her movements are still controlled, still precise, but he sees the strain in the way she holds herself, the way her breaths come just a little too sharp. She's running on instinct. On survival. How much farther? She asks, voice barely above a whisper. Daniel checks his watch. A few miles. We need to reach the loading docks before sunrise. Trey nods, shifting Ravi's weight in her arms. The baby is wrapped tight in thick layers, his face barely visible beneath the fabric. But even in sleep, he looks fragile. Then, a sound. Soft at first. A distant hum, low and steady, cutting through the wind. Engines. Daniel stiffens. Trey hears it too. Her hand shoots out, grabbing his sleeve, fingers digging into the fabric. They're tracking us. Daniel scans their surroundings. Open road. No cover. But ahead. A highway overpass. Partially collapsed, buried in snow, abandoned. He jerks his head toward it. Come on. They move fast, ducking beneath the ruined structure, pressing themselves into the frozen earth. The cold seeps into their skin, numbing, but they don't move. They listen. The sound grows louder. Then, a beam of light cuts through the darkness. A patrol drone. It hovers above the road, its mechanical eye sweeping the snow, scanning, searching. Trey holds Ravi closer. The baby stirs, a tiny movement, but he doesn't cry. Daniel doesn't blink, doesn't breathe. The drone pauses. Its spotlight lingers, bright and unwavering. Then, it moves on. The hum fades. The darkness returns. A long moment of silence. Then Trey exhales, slow and careful, her breath shaking just slightly. Daniel touches her shoulder, a silent reassurance. We need to keep moving. She nods. They climb out from the wreckage and step onto the road again. No time to rest. No time for relief. The ship is waiting. They just have to make it there. The industrial district sprawls before them, hollow and abandoned, a skeleton of rust and steel. The docks loom in the distance, their towering cranes frozen like the bones of long-dead giants. Cargo containers, stacked high, cast deep shadows under the flickering glow of failing floodlights. The wind moves through the empty streets, whistling through broken windows, rattling loose sheets of metal. Daniel holds up a hand. Stop. Trey halts, tightening her grip on Ravi. The baby doesn't stir, wrapped in layers, shielded from the biting cold. Her breath comes in short, controlled bursts, forming ghostly plumes in the night air. Stay here, Daniel whispers. She hesitates but nods, pressing back into the shadows. Daniel moves forward, slow and deliberate, every step calculated. His eyes sweep the area, searching for movement. The ship should be docked at Bay 14, a smuggler's vessel, old and discreet, one of the few willing to take refugees off-world. Then he sees it. A lone figure near the entrance. Armed. Daniel's pulse quickens. Not a smuggler. Not part of the deal. A patrol. He ducks behind a stack of rusting crates, pressing his back against the frozen metal. His mind races. One shot would be too loud. A fight too messy. If the guard calls for backup, it's over. His fingers hover near the grip of his pistol. He steadies his breathing. They can't turn back now. Trey watches him from the shadows, her posture rigid, waiting for his signal. They are so close. But one wrong move. And everything ends. Daniel's mind works fast. The guard is alone, but that doesn't mean he's unprotected. Reinforcements could be waiting just out of sight, a single radio call away. A firefight would be suicide. They need a distraction. Trey understands before he even signals. Her instincts are sharp-honed by years of survival. She reaches into her coat, fingers wrapping around a small metallic device. A signal jammer. She flicks the switch. A faint hum vibrates against her palm. A few seconds later. The guard's earpiece crackles. His frown deepens. He taps at it, confused. Control, I'm losing signal. Repeat dash. Static. The frustration in his voice is clear. He mutters a curse, adjusting his radio, turning slightly away from the entrance. That's their moment. Daniel signals Trey. They move. Quick. Silent. Their footsteps are swallowed by the night as they weave through the shadows, keeping low, breath held tight in their lungs. The guard, still distracted, doesn't notice as they slip past the loading bay doors. They're in. But the real danger is just beginning. The ship looms in the dimly lit hangar, a battered cargo freighter covered in layers of crude repair work. Orion's Wake. The name is barely legible beneath streaks of rust and carbon scoring, a ghost of its former self. Its hull, patched with mismatched plating, tells a story of too many close calls, too many desperate escapes. Daniel steps onto the loading ramp, his boots echoing against the worn metal. The air inside is thick with the scent of fuel, oil, and something acrid like overheated circuits. Scattered crates litter the bay, some stamped with names of off-world colonies, others unmarked, their contents unknown. Then. Footsteps. A man emerges from the cockpit, his silhouette tall and imposing. His coat is scuffed, heavy with the weight of years in deep space. A cybernetic eye flickers in the dim light, cold and unreadable. Captain Elias Kane. He stops at the top of the ramp, arms crossed, unimpressed. His gaze sweeps over them. Daniel, Trey, the sleeping child. You're late. His voice is gravel and steel. Daniel doesn't waste time. Is the payment ready? Kane smirks. I don't work for free, Carter. You got the creds. Daniel reaches into his coat and pulls out a small data chip. The last of his savings. His ticket off-world. He holds it up between two fingers. Half now. Half when we're in orbit. Kane takes it, flipping it between his fingers before sliding it into a scanner. A pause. Then. A soft beep. Transaction confirmed. Kane pockets the chip. All right. He jerks a thumb toward the interior. Get in. We leave in 5. Daniel exhales, the tension easing just slightly. They made it? For now. The engines rumble, deep and powerful, shaking the walls of the freighter. The scent of burning fuel thickens as the ship comes alive, ancient thrusters cycling up with a whine that vibrates through the deck. The loading ramp hisses, sealing shut with a heavy clang. Outside. A flicker of movement. The guard, still fiddling with his radio, suddenly straightens. His voice crackles over the comms, sharp with urgency. We have unauthorized movement in the docks dash. Too late. The ship shudders, lifting off. Daniel grips the edge of a crate as the freighter tilts, engines roaring against gravity. The world outside the viewport shifts, metallic docks giving way to a sprawling cityscape. Lights blur beneath them, shrinking, swallowed by shadows. The patrols are scrambling now, but they're already too far. By the time they lock onto the ship, Orion's wake will be nothing more than a fading signal in the upper atmosphere. Trey sits near the bulkhead, arms wrapped protectively around Ravi. Her fingers tremble slightly, though she doesn't say a word. For the first time in weeks. They're safe. But Daniel knows the truth. The real danger doesn't end here. Not even close. The Orion's wake drifts through the abyss, a rusted speck swallowed by the infinite black. Outside, it's just another forgotten freighter, lost among the stars. But inside, tension lingers. Daniel leans against the cold metal wall of the cargo hold, watching Trey as she rocks Ravi in her arms. The baby is quiet now, his tiny form bundled against her chest, his soft breaths barely audible over the steady hum of the ship's engines. For the first time in days, there's no immediate threat, no footsteps in the snow, no voices in the dark. But peace is an illusion. Footsteps echo through the hold. Kane strides in, arms crossed, his cybernetic eye flickering as he scans them. He stops a few feet away, tilting his head. His expression is unreadable, but his voice is edged with something close to amusement. You didn't tell me you were bringing a Villery. Daniel straightens. His fingers twitch at his side, not reaching for his weapon, not yet. That a problem? Kane gives a dry chuckle. You think I'm stupid? The whole damn sector's on high alert for a missing Villery and her kid. He gestures at Trey, then Ravi. You're hot cargo, Carter. Trey stiffens, her arms tightening around Ravi. Her face remains calm, but Daniel knows her well enough to see the shift in her posture. The readiness. Daniel steps forward. You already took the payment. You're getting us to the outer colonies. Kane exhales through his nose, tilting his head slightly. Yeah? And what if someone offers me more to turn you in? A long silence. Then Trey moves. It's subtle, too subtle. But Kane notices. She shifts just slightly, positioning herself between him and Ravi, her weight balanced, her muscles coiled beneath her coat. It's not fear. It's preparation. Kane smirks. Relax, sweetheart. I don't sell people. He leans back against a crate, arms still crossed. But I do need to know exactly who's after you. Because if they come knocking while you're on my ship, I need to know if I should run or shoot. Trey hesitates. Her lips press into a tight line. Then, finally, she speaks. They're called the Dominion. The smirk vanishes from Kane's face. For the first time since they met him, he looks uneasy. Daniel's chest tightens. You know them? Kane rubs his jaw, exhaling slowly. Yeah, he mutters. And trust me, you do not want them on your tail. The Orion's wake hums, its engines vibrating through the metal floors, the sound settling deep into Daniel's bones. Time stretches in the void, measured only by the slow pulse of the ship's control panels and the faint rise and fall of Trey's breathing as she watches Ravi sleep. It's quiet. Too quiet. Then a shrill beep pierces the silence. Kane mutters a curse, flicking a switch on the console. His cybernetic eye glows faintly as he scans the incoming data. We've got company. Daniel moves closer, his stomach nodding. Dominion. Kane nods grimly. Small scout vessel. Low emission signal, trying to stay hidden. His fingers dance over the controls, bringing up a grainy silhouette of the ship. Sleek, predatory. Tracking them. Trey steps up beside Daniel, her voice steady. Can we lose them? Kane exhales, running a hand through his unshaven jaw. Not in open space. If they're tracking us, they've got a lock on our trajectory. They'll just follow, wait for backup. Daniel grips the edge of the console. Options. Kane's gaze flicks across the star map, scanning rapidly. Then. There. He stabs a finger at the screen. We need a gravity well. Something big enough to disrupt their signal lock. His voice drops lower. Nearest one is the Vania Nebula. Daniel doesn't react, but Trey stiffens. That's a pirate sector, she says quietly. Kane smirks, but there's no humor in it. Exactly. He looks at them. Dominion won't follow us in there. Too unpredictable. Too many eyes watching. They don't like variables. Daniel and Trey exchange a glance. They don't like it. They shouldn't. But the alternative? They don't have one. Kane doesn't wait for approval. His fingers move over the controls. Engines flare. The ship veers sharply, breaking from its original course. The stars outside shift, stretching into distorted streaks of light as the Orion's wake plunges toward the nebula. A place where no law holds. A place where even the Dominion fears to tread. They don't have a choice. They disappear into the storm. The Vania Nebula looms ahead, an immense, churning storm of blue and violet, its swirling gases shifting like a living thing. Lightning fractures the darkness in jagged veins, illuminating ghostly silhouettes of derelict ships' twisted wreckage drifting through the void, their hulls split open like ancient carcasses. Kane grips the controls tighter. His cybernetic eye flickers, scanning the storm's chaotic patterns. Hold on. Then. The Orion's wake plunges into the nebula. The moment they breach the threshold, turbulence slams through the ship. The hull groans, metal straining against unseen forces. The viewport becomes a blur of rolling clouds, flashes of light streaking past like silent explosions. Ravi stirs. Then, a sharp, startled cry. Trey pulls him close, rocking gently, whispering something soothing. But Daniel can see it in her face, the same thing he feels. Fear. A sudden, piercing alarm blares. Red warning lights flare to life, bathing the cockpit in an eerie glow. Kane curses. Shit. We've got incoming signatures multiple dash. Daniel pushes off the wall, steadying himself as another violent tremor shakes the ship. Trey is already at the weapons console, her hands hovering over the controls, scanning the readings. Pirates. Kane's jaw tightens. Yeah. And they're not the friendly kind. Daniel turns toward Trey. Their eyes meet. From the frying pan into the fire. The Orion's wake hurtles through the nebula, its hull rattling like a dying heartbeat. Static crackles over the comms, distorted by the storm. Then, a voice cuts through. Low. Rough. Dangerous. Unknown vessel, you are trespassing in Vania space. Power down your engines or be fired upon. Daniel stiffens. Kane mutters a curse under his breath. Trey's fingers twitch over the weapons console. If we stop, we're dead. Kane exhales sharply. And if we run, they'll tear us apart before we make it out of here. A silence. Then, Daniel steps forward. Open a channel. Kane blinks. What? Do it? Kane hesitates, then flips a switch. A faint hiss of static, then. You're live. Daniel leans in, his voice calm. Controlled. This is Captain Carter of the Orion's wake. We're not here to cause trouble. Just passing through. A beat of silence. Then. Laughter. Low. Cruel. A captain, huh? Fancy title for a rust bucket like that. Daniel clenches his jaw. Look, we're not worth your time. You let us go, and we won't be a problem. Another pause. A flicker of something over the comms, muffled voices. Discussion. Then. The pirate replies, his tone shifting. You're carrying a velary, aren't you? A breath of silence. Trey stiffens. Kane's fingers twitch over the controls. Daniel feels the weight of the moment settle over him, a heavy, suffocating thing. They know. Daniel keeps his voice even, measured. He knows hesitation will get them killed. I don't know what you're talking about. A chuckle crackles through the comms, low, amused, predatory. Nice try, the pirate drawls. The Dominion put a bounty on her head big enough to buy a moon. And you? You just walked into our backyard with the prize. Trey's fingers dig into the console. Her breath is steady, but Daniel can see the tension in her shoulders. She knows what this means. Ravi whimpers. Just a faint, tired sound, but enough to make Kane mutter under his breath. This is bad, he says. Daniel's mind is a storm, calculations running at hyperspeed. They can't outrun them. The ship's too slow. They can't outgun them. The Orion's wake wasn't built for combat, and these pirates know this nebula better than anyone. So, they have to outsmart them. He takes a slow breath, steadying himself. Then he speaks. Listen, he says, voice firm, unshaken. The Dominion doesn't just want the Villery. They want everyone who's helped them. You turn us in, and they'll put you on their list too. Silence. The pirate doesn't laugh this time. Daniel presses forward. You've dealt with the Dominion before. You know how they operate. You think they'll just pay you and leave? No. They'll wipe you out. No loose ends. More silence. Daniel's fingers twitch at his side. He can feel the weight of their hesitation hanging in the dead air like a blade suspended by a thread. Then, a soft click. The pirate is back on the comms. His voice lower now. Darker. You're full of shit, Captain. Daniel risks a glance at Trey. She meets his eyes. And nods. Do it. He takes a breath, then delivers the final blow. Maybe. But are you willing to bet your life on it? A long, heavy pause. Then, the comms go silent. The pirate ships hold position. Seconds stretch into an eternity. Then, without a word, they break formation. The radar screen clears. They're letting them go. Kane exhales, running a hand down his face. Holy shit. Daniel steps back, heart hammering against his ribs. His hands are steady, but only because he won't let them shake. He looks at Trey. She's staring at him, something flickering in her eyes. Something new. Respect. And maybe trust. The Orion's wake finally breaks free of the nebula, emerging into the endless stretch of open space. The turbulence is gone. No flashing alarms. No voices on the comms, demanding their surrender. For the first time in what feels like forever, they're safe. Daniel exhales, a slow release of tension that had settled into his bones. He slumps against the bulkhead, exhaustion weighing down every muscle. Kane stretches, groaning. Hell of a night. I need a drink. Trey is quiet, cradling Ravi in her arms. The baby has fallen asleep again, tiny fingers curled against her mother's chest. The faint rhythm of her breathing fills the space between them. Daniel watches Trey. The dim light of the cockpit softens her expression, making her look almost at peace. After a moment, she looks up, her voice low. Steady. You saved us. Daniel gives a tired smile. That's what captains do. Trey tilts her head slightly. You're not really a captain. Daniel shrugs. Maybe not. But you're not just a refugee, either. A pause. Then, a rare smile from Trey. Soft. Genuine. And for the first time, Daniel allows himself to hope. The ship descends through the atmosphere, breaking through thick layers of clouds. Sunlight catches on its hull, painting streaks of gold across its rusted frame. The Orion's wake isn't much to look at, patched, dented, battle-worn, but right now, it carries something more precious than cargo. Hope. With a hiss of pressurized air, the landing gear engages. The ship settles onto the soft soil of a quiet world, one untouched by war, by Dominion rule, by the endless chase of survival. Daniel steps out first, his boots sinking slightly into the earth. Fresh air. Real air, not the stale, recycled kind he's grown used to. The scent of damp soil and distant vegetation fills his lungs, grounding him in a way he hasn't felt in years. Behind him, Trey steps onto the ground, hesitant at first. She holds Ravi close, as if expecting the universe to snatch this moment away. The baby stirs but doesn't wake, her tiny fingers curled against Trey's jacket. For the first time since this all began, Trey isn't looking over her shoulder. Kane lingers by the ship, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with an unreadable expression. Then, after a beat, he exhales and shakes his head. "You sure about this?" His voice carries a casual edge, but there's something deeper beneath it. A warning. A chance for Daniel to reconsider. Kane leans against the hull, giving a smirk that doesn't quite reach his eyes. "You could come with me, Carter. I know a few places where a guy like you could make some good credits." Daniel lets the offer hang in the air for a moment. The old Daniel, the one who lived from job to job, always moving, always surviving, might have said yes. But not this time. He shakes his head. Not this time. Kane studies him for a long moment, then chuckles. "Didn't think so." With a lazy salute, he turns, walking up the loading ramp. A moment later, the ship's engines ignite, sending dust swirling into the air. The Orion's wake rises, climbing back into the sky until it's nothing more than a streak of light. Then just silence. Daniel stands there, feeling the weight of something new settle on his shoulders. Not fear. Not regret. A future. Trey watches him carefully. "You're really staying?" Daniel looks at her. At Ravi. At the endless stretch of open land ahead of them, the promise of something more. And he nods. "Yeah. I think I am." Trey doesn't answer right away. But after a moment, she reaches out and takes his hand. The wind shifts, carrying the scent of wildflowers and possibility. And Daniel Carter knows. He made the right choice. Morning breaks over the colony, golden light spilling across the horizon like liquid fire. The sky is vast and open, stretching beyond the hills, beyond the rivers that cut through the valley, beyond the limits of anything Daniel has ever known. He stands outside their new home, a modest structure, nothing fancy, but real. Real walls. Real ground beneath his feet. A place where he doesn't have to sleep with a weapon under his pillow. A place where he doesn't have to run. The cool morning air fills his lungs, crisp and fresh. The kind of air that reminds you you're alive. Inside, he hears the soft hum of Trey's voice, low and soothing. Rocking Ravi to sleep. A melody he doesn't recognize, but one that feels like it belongs here. Daniel closes his eyes for a brief moment. He never thought he'd have this. A second chance. And yet here it is. He turns his gaze toward the horizon, watching as the first rays of sunlight chase away the shadows. For the first time in years, Daniel Carter isn't running. He's home.